Hey man, yeah, welcome to Ronin Tattoo. Yeah, my name's Kiwi Matt. Give you a little detail on that. Kiwi is the name that New Zealanders self-apply to being from New Zealand. Some people are like, oh, I like the fruit. And I'm like, no, that's named after us as well because we used to grow the most of it like in the 80s and 70s in New Zealand. I don't know why we self-apply that. We have a bird in New Zealand called the kiwi that doesn't fly. I've never seen one. One of my friends has. We're definitely pretty proud of it. It's the symbol of our Air Force, even though it doesn't fly, which is quite ironic. But that's my professional name in tattooing. I was born Matthew Wayne Lloyd. My parents, I think, were hoping more for a lawyer, maybe. But they ended up with a tattooer. I was born in 1977 in Auckland, New Zealand, and to a fairly working class family at that time. My dad was a glazier, and my mother just sort of had odd jobs. Back in those days, the mums stayed at home for the most part. I remember my dad actually saying that when mum had to get a job, he felt kind of fairly inadequate, so different times. Excuse me. But yeah, so I lived in Auckland until I was 7 years old, and then I moved to Nelson in the South Island. My dad took a sort of promotion down there in his industry, and we moved down there. And yeah, it was an interesting time in my life. We came from Auckland, the biggest city, and Kiwis are fairly competitive, and I was what they call a townie. So yeah, I came from the big smoke. And I was kind of a double townie too, because later on when I lived, growing up there, I'd come from Auckland and then I lived in the town, So the town Richmond I lived in, we had 7,000 people, but most of the kids I went to school with lived rural. So I was like the double townie, So you were kind of frowned upon twice. But it was a really small area that I grew up in, really good people, good at heart. The main city, Nelson, at that time was about 36,000 people. Richmond was about 8,000, But again, like if you lived in one of those areas, you were the big city kids, Yeah. And growing up, I don't know, New Zealand was very much sort of built around rugby and sort of team sports. And I definitely was on the periph a little bit, skateboarding I discovered in 1986. And it sort of gave me the freedom that I needed, It definitely, skateboarding in those days, it was sort of pre-Red Bull sort of money. You weren't the cool kids for skating, We were sort of, I wouldn't say we were the geeks, but we were the outcasts, I kind of liked that though. I was always the kid that sort of did stuff to see how it felt, not so much for the attention. Unfortunately, sometimes there was a lot of attention, but I remember like dyeing my hair pink or something like that just to see kind of how it felt, But yeah, growing up, skateboarding, extreme, later things like motocross, snowboarding, it was my escapism a little bit. Yeah. I was thinking today about what Freud said about families, and I think to myself, fuck, he must have had a hot mum. You know what I mean? You're sitting down the pub, you're Freud, your boys turn up, and they're like, hey man, what's happening? And you're like, dude, I was just thinking about how hot my mum is, And she was so hot that one of your boys went, yeah. And then, he had that other friend that was like, yeah, I'd fuck her again. I wasn't particularly close growing up in my family. I did get on really well with my mum, but I always felt like I was meant to be somewhere else. I don't know why. I had a good life and, I was taken care of, but I always wanted to be somewhere else. I think all the culture that I was sort of immersed in was very much in the States to me, I remember like just that sort of on-screen freedom the Americans seemed to have, they were doing cool shit, but like kind of yahooing around a little bit too. And, I think American culture is a little bit like that when you look at like who people idolize, whether it's like a Wyatt Earp, he's the good guy, but he's sort of the bad guy too. And I just, everything to me that I wanted in life seemed to be somewhere else. But it was a pipe dream at that point because, I wasn't a good student at school. So it wasn't like I was going to be getting, an opportunity to go to school in America or like transfer from some job where people were just begging me to come, So it just, at that point, it was a pipe dream. I had seen a little bit of tattooing growing up. My grandfather was in the Navy. And at that time, though, I didn't sort of realize how cool his tats were. He had some real sort of Navy tattoos. I remember he had a stork on his back, holding a bundle with like his oldest two kids' names, Most of the tattooing, though, that I saw though in those old days was like was Moko, like Maori-style tattooing. Sometimes you were lucky and you got to see like one of the people that would have the Moko on their face, which when I was growing up was pretty daunting. Now I think like, man, that's so cool, that sort of level of commitment. But yeah, I had seen it, but it wasn't fully on my radar. But I was starting to become aware of like during this time, it was the combination of like, when X Games was coming around and the art that we grew up with on the skateboards, the different sort of sports heroes that were coming out, sort of the Jamie Lyns later on and like the Jason Jessies, the people that were in magazines that started to appear wearing tattoos that weren't sort of biker culture, which is what we had a lot of in New Zealand. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that time period of tattooing, but it wasn't what I was drawn to, I think most of the time people want something a little bit different initially than like what their uncle or their older brother had, So I had seen, I suppose, a little bit of that sort of just really biker tattooing. That was more sort of, it was more sort of about having something applied than actually having something a little bit more artistic or expression, But I was aware of tattooing. And then as I started to get into my I was still at school, but in my mid to later teens, I remember going to like a careers evening and I'd started thinking like, maybe I want to be a tattooer. And I was at this careers evening and I remember the lady who was running it said to the parents, write down what you think your son wants to be or your daughter. My mum wrote down like professional skateboarder, but like I wanted to be, which was never going to be an option. I loved skating, but I wasn't that good, I wanted to be a tattooer. And I remember like, when the ladies, so she was a teacher, she was walking around, and what do you want to be? And I was like, I would like to be a tattooer. No, you don't want to do that. You want to be an architect if you want to do something with drawing, So it was like, instantly I got sort of lumped into like, if you're going to be an architect, then you have to do all these sciences and things, which I already wasn't very good at because I'm a little bit dyslexic, But it did put me in, I was already doing like what we call technical drawing, in the old days before using computers for design. So I kind of come from that background in drawing, which I think kind of helped me a little bit later on, just in the sense too that like, a lot of the times, like if you're doing something in a drafting sort of thing, you're designing something for, or, a house for a section or something like that. Whereas a lot of other backgrounds I see with people with art, it's almost like they draw a house and then they're trying to find a section for it, So I think that element really helped me. But it also kind of ruined school for me because instead of getting put into like art classes or going and doing some outdoor ed or something like that, I'm now in all these science classes because I told someone I wanted to be a tattooer and they've decided that I need to be an architect. But around the end of my school time, high school, I was down at a skate park one day and this kid turned up. And I'm pretty sure actually my buddy Pete, who I'm still friends with, who's a skater, I'm pretty sure he knows who this guy is. But like, he turned up and he had this entourage of chicks with him and he's skating. It's a hot day, and the dude's just like ripped. And he's like got this huge tribal tattoo on his arm, And it was a little bit like if you've ever watched somebody back in the day smoking, they would talk with the cigarette, you know, it almost like added inches to them or something, you know, they'd be like, blah, 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 blah. This guy, like, he was, you know, he'd be pulling these big moves and shit, but he was like leaning his tat into it. And I remember thinking, like, I got to get me some of that, you know what I mean? Like when you're younger, you know, like you imagine that time and place, or like when you think about the tattoo, like, you know, like you imagine where you're going to be with it and how you're going to look, sort of thing, you know. The opposite of like where most tattooers are now. No one gives a fuck if I get another tattoo. Like, you know what I mean? It's no one cares at all. Yeah. So I just kind of had that in my head, and it got to the end of my senior year, and a buddy of mine, Rick, was going to Dunedin, you know, a city in the south of New Zealand, to go see his dad. And his dad was like good fun to be around, you know. Rick's parents had split up a long time ago, so when we went to see Rick's dad, it was like, you know, he wasn't trying to be the parent too much. He was making sure we had a good time. So Rick said to me, do you want to go? And I'm like, all right, we'll go, but we're getting tattoos. And, you know, and Rick was like, yeah, cool. And so we went on this trip, you know, two dudes road tripping down the South Island in New Zealand. I remember it because it was awesome. Like, you know, school had just finished. I was going to do like a Polytech course next year. Because of that, banks were like, you know, they're trying to get these young adults to sign up with them. So they're like, okay, well, if you're going to be a student next year, we'll give you a 0% overdraft, you know. Fucking sick. Free money, man. So like, we're heading down there. I'm going to get this tattoo. I remember on the way, we like stopped on the coast somewhere, like it might have been like Timaru or Oamaru or somewhere like that. We're just sitting in this park eating like a pie or whatever. And on this bench, there was a wallet, and it was full of money. And I remember just picking it up and being like, holy shit, right? So of course we took it to the police station. Did we fuck? I opened it up, and it's like inside there was like, what I know now, but at the time it was like pimp photos, you know. This wallet's stacked with cash, and it's got like photos of like nothing nude or whatever, but you know, there's some dude with his shirt off and some Asian looking chick or whatever. Yeah. So we took that money and we just had a really awesome time. I do remember though on that trip before. So anyway, Rick went to pass this car, and he'd looked in his mirror, and there had been a car behind us, you know. Obviously it's in New Zealand, so he's on the other side. There was a car behind us way back, which must have been like hella speeding, because when Rick pulled out, we were well in excess of the speed limit, you know. And this is like in Rick's like Mark I Ford Escort, you know, super cool car. And as we pulled out, this car behind us just literally came past us flying, and Rick clipped it because he just didn't know it was there. So obviously the car pulled over up ahead, we pulled over, and I'm thinking, oh shit, you know, pretty awkward. But then like as the car doors opened, two cops got out of it. I was just like, great, you know what I mean? We just had this windfall of cash, now we've got this going on. And it was a young cop who was driving, and then it was a young female police officer that was with him. And so I think, you know, who polices the police, right? Like obviously he was probably trying to impress her, but now they got problems because it turned out to be like his boss's car. It was kind of all swept under the rug. Like Rick ended up getting a ticket out of it, but it was like, I don't know, you know, but it was just, I don't know. I just remember thinking, you know, like just going from like finding a pimp's wallet. Now we've crashed into a bunch of cops. I mean, this trip had doom written all over it, you know, but it was amazing. We were two young guys, you know, just out free doing some cool shit. That trip was whatever. I spent a whole bunch of money that I ended up owing for ages. But at the end of the trip, I went to get a tattoo as we'd planned. Rick kind of bailed on me. I mean, I don't blame him. It wasn't his idea, you know. But so he ended up sitting out in this car, and I went in to see this tattoo studio. Again, you know, nothing about research. It just said tattoo above the door. Went in, knocked on a door because everything, you know, there was like a waiting room with some designs, but everything was sealed off. And this like really, really biker lady comes out, and you know, if my memory's correct, actually, I think she said something like, "What do you want?" Right? And I was like, thinking about getting a tattoo, and she was like, "Oh, what are you thinking about getting?" And I, I'd had a design that I'd drawn up, in my pocket for ages. But in the last minute, I just kind of bottled it and went, that. And I picked another tribal design that she had on the wall, this tribal design, yeah. This was that like time period of like just being sort of, urban primitive. Like I think I was kind of hoping one day I might have been an extra in Point Break 2 or something like that, had they made it, I don't know. There was definitely that kind of trustafarian lifestyle that everybody was trying to lead back in that point in the 90s. But I remember like, I'm shit scared of needles, and I remember, again, like that thing I was saying before, the kind of energy of imagining where I was going to be wearing this tattoo kind of carried me through the experience. And, it's a really easy part on the body that I got tattooed. So yeah, it was it was a cool experience. But that experience sort of led me to thinking, like, I wonder if I could do that, Like I'd always wanted to, but, in those days in New Zealand, I remember growing up, there was like one tattoo shop in my hometown, and it was I don't know, when I was a little kid, like it was pretty daunting to me, They didn't really name tattoos studios in those days that made you want to kind of come in. Like I remember the one in my hometown was called like Spellbound or something like that, But like, you would see them too, like there'd be Poison Ink or something like that. And in my mind, I always thought, why don't you just go with like, hepatitis? You could have a series of shops like A, B, and C, or, like it was just different times. So at this point, it's on the back burner. I'm wanting to get more tattoos. This is also around the time where I like kind of learned a valuable lesson in tattooing, and I try and explain this to my clients today when they're booking in, if you have to wait for a little bit. But when I was growing up, and then I was old enough to get tattoos, we had one shop in town, and then later there was two shops. And the second shop, I didn't know this guy at this point, but he'll end up coming around again in my stories. His name was Wok, and Wok had moved to Nelson from somewhere in the North Island, I think. And, with only one tattooer in town and then this new guy, and he was sort of a little bit more, he was kind of closer to my mindset a little bit in tattooing. Like, he'd come up through the old school ranks a little bit, but he was more kind of the future a little bit, And really quickly, he was booked out. For a town of such a small population, I think he was booked out for about 3 weeks. So when I wanted my second tattoo, I went to see him, and he said he couldn't tattoo me for 3 weeks. So I went to the other guy that could tattoo me tomorrow, right? Because it's like buying a medication. When do you want to feel good, now or later, right? So, yeah, and weirdly enough, the tattoo that I got, it was all right, from this guy, Will, at Spellbound. But it's like, I kind of learned something in that, when you're young, you want to feel good now. You want the instant gratification, but it's, 40 years after that, are you going to care that you waited 3 weeks or not? Probably not, right? So I ended up needing a job. I had a fairly serious girlfriend at around these times, and, there was no path into tattooing right at the moment, and certainly not one I wanted to take in New Zealand had there been, an option at all. So I ended up getting into chefing. I'd always enjoyed cooking, and that kind of led me thinking to like heading overseas. I'd met another tattooer who was kind of doing it as a hobby in New Zealand. I'd told my tale of woe about this tattoo that I had got, and I wasn't very happy. I told to a friend of mine, Rick, who I'd worked with, and he goes, "Oh, you got to go see my friend Matt." Rick was a real trip. Rick was getting Tommy Lee's tribal tattoo, like verbatim on his back, which is a super fucking cool story, right? Like, if you're going to get a tattoo, you might as well get Tommy Lee's back piece. Yeah. Yeah, and Matt had been kind of quite an inspiration. I really enjoyed going to see him, It was a very sort of like visceral experience. Like, you always, I think when you start going to a tattoo studio when you're young, on the regular, there's that smell when you walk in, the disinfectant or whatever. it kind of it made the same impression on me as those like total psychopaths you went to school with who had like a sticker or a racer collection in the 80s. Remember that like really toxic smell that they had? You know what I mean though? Like, you know, that shit that you'd probably get sued for selling to children now. You remember that shit slime, dude? You ever see that shit? It was like this radioactive looking green goop. And in the 80s, they would set you on TV, get some slime, you know, and you would go like this with it, I guess like a liquid slinky or something, and then you'd keep it back in its little trash. Actually, the container it was kept in looked like a trash can. But by the end of the first week, you had half the cat in there, you know, like, yeah, terrible toy. Same thing though, like it had a really weird smell to it that probably, I don't know, probably causes cancer or something. Yeah, but so I used to go see Matt. Every time I would get tattooed by him, he would be playing Ministry Filth Pig. Like when I think of that album today, like anytime I hear it, I instantly think of going to Matt's place. But he'd sort of said to me too, he was like, look, man, you know, I mean, he wasn't trying to help me get into tattooing or anything, you know, I hadn't asked him, but he sort of said to me, he goes, go overseas, like get overseas and, you know, get an apprenticeship or something over there, you know, because if you try to get into it here, you know, there's only going to be so far you go, really, you know. And I was like, that's a really good point. So I spent about 18 months saving up really hard with my then pretty serious girlfriend. We were living together in Dunedin, and you know, we would save each week as much money as we could. We had little sort of chart on the wall where every time we saved another $100, we would color it in, you know. And we were planning to go to England. And back in those days, like if you were part of the Commonwealth, you know, and you know you'd been a good kid, you didn't have a criminal record or something like that, you could get like a 2-year work visa to England. I was actually eligible to get a 4-year visa because my grandparents were still English citizens. Yeah, so we got those visas, and yeah, we headed over to England, and I ended up just really randomly, we ended up in this little town called St. Neots, and we'd ended up there because I had this like distant cousin from England that would stop in New Zealand sometimes, and she was telling me that her boyfriend lived in this town, we should go stay with him for a little bit, and so we ended up staying there. She ended up breaking up with this guy, John, and John today is still one of my best friends, and I haven't spoken to my cousin in like 25 years. But like, yeah, you know, but it was this little market town, you know, really weird to probably end up there. I know the locals always thought it was kind of weird when we were there, you know, when we stood out like sore thumbs, like, you know, and, you know, at that time everybody was sort of like quite tidy and stuff, and we're this like sort of new age, you know, urban primitive looking couple that are living there. But again, so I'm using cooking. I haven't found a way into tattooing yet at all. And then eventually I managed to meet one of the tattooers in a tattoo shop downtown. His name was Tommy. He was working there. It was Owl's Tattoo Studio. And I met Tommy outside one day when he was having a cigarette, and he was actually quite receptive. I talked to him, and around this time I'd been like drawing some sort of designs and selling them to some tattoo studios and that. It was a different time in these like sort of out of London little villages or little towns in England, because it wasn't so much about the artistic scene. It was the social sort of element of having a tattoo. You know, you weren't always the tattooer necessarily because you were the best artist in town. You were the tattooer because maybe you were hard enough to be that person, you know. But yeah, Tommy was pretty cool. He sort of blew me off a little bit though. I told him like, oh, I'm doing some stuff. He's like, come back and see me. I went back to see him a few weeks later, and he'd had a bit of a falling out, I think, with Al. And I think Tommy's brother-in-law worked at Al's as a piercer, and he'd said to me like, oh no, Tommy's opening a studio around the street, you should go see him. I think he just thought I was looking for a tattoo. So I went to see him, and basically just started, you know, hanging out with him while he was building this studio out, and you know, helping him here and there, shift a bit of wood or whatever, and just I guess being young and annoying, you know. Obviously, I was cooking to pay the bills, and then once he opened the place, I just started hanging out there a little bit, and you know, I was working split shifts in those days, so I would work in the morning cooking. I'd have a few hours off in the afternoon, and then I'd work in the evening again, you know. So I would go and hang out with him in my hours off. And it just got to the point where it was like, you know, I think one day he's busy or something. He's like, oh, Matt, can you book these people in? Or, you know, can you make a cup of coffee or something like that? And then eventually I just kept sort of badgering him. He said no a lot, but I think, I don't know, I've heard this a lot from artists my age. You know, we all pretty much have that story. It's a variation of it, but, you know, I don't really know anybody that became a tattooer in my age group really, who had somebody teach them that like doesn't have that story of being like, dude, fuck off, you know, and just not giving up. But so eventually Tommy took me on, but it was like, I was taken on as an apprentice, you know, like I wasn't taken on to work. I sometimes have like, and don't get me wrong, I like all age of clients, but I sometimes have young people hit me up like, oh, I'd like to be a tattooer. What does it pay? You know, and I'm just like, bro, like, I spent 18 months like getting up at 5:30 in the morning to go and cook breakfast and then hit just the beginning of the morning shift. I would go and work for free in a tattoo shop until 6 p.m. and then I'd go and work again until midnight, you know. But it was really good because it gave me a good work ethic, you know. And yeah, it was pretty cool. It was it was different times too, because eventually when it became time for me to get some tattoo equipment, at that time, and I still use a lot of it today, but at that time, like, there was an artist turned machine maker called Mickey Sharps, and, you know, generally considered he made the best machines. And I called him up. You know, there was no website, there's no eBay, there's no Chinese knockoffs or whatever. It's like, you know, if somebody had an old catalog, you found the number and you called up. And I called up Mickey and I said, hey, I'm learning to tattoo in Cambridgeshire. You know, I would like to order this, and this machine. And he was like, oh, Cambridgeshire, huh? Do you know this guy? I was like, nah. He goes, oh, right, do you know this person? I was like, no. He goes, well, who the fuck are you then? And hung up on me, you know. I really had to know someone, you know. Tommy had to call back on my behalf and, you know, and get the machines, which he did. And, yeah, you know, it was cool. I remember too, like, people often say, you know, how hard was it back in the day to find people to tattoo on and when you're learning, and wasn't very hard at all, to be honest. You know, you learn pretty quickly when the price is right. People are happy to pay it. You know, so I should give a little background on Tommy. Actually, Tommy, when he was growing up, he'd always been sort of artsy, but when he was growing up, he'd worked for Al. The other guy in town, he'd worked for him before, where like Al had actually had a tattoo studio in his garage, and like Tommy and one other guy would do the colors and tattoos. Like Al would outline them and then Tommy would like actually fill it in, you know? And yeah, Tommy was a really, really, really cool guy to be around, you know? I think being a like skinny little geeky kid from New Zealand and then turning up in England, it gave me kind of just what I needed, you know? I've definitely collected a lot of sort of male role models over the years, and Tommy was one of them. You know, he was a good dude to me. And once I started tattooing, it was definitely different than like what Tommy was doing or what his background, you know. But it was an interesting time in tattooing because everything's kind of knee-jerk reaction, you know. Al actually, I think, looking back, did some pretty cool tats. Like, he made a lot of really traditional tats. And at this time when I went to England, everybody was on the like, you know, like, oh, he tattoos. Is it fine line, you know? But it was like sort of the reaction to the fact that, you know, when you get a tattoo, you want something different than what your dad had or something like that, which is, which I think is sometimes one of the mistakes people make when they first get into tattooing, because it's not like reinventing the wheel. What works today is what generally worked before, But yeah, so pretty quickly, people, and I wouldn't say that I took to it like a duck to water, it's definitely the tattoo machine was a lot more cumbersome and heavy than I was expecting, when I actually finally got to start making a few tattoos. And Tommy was really good. Like, he would have me, there'd be some friend of the shop, someone that I'd sat with while he was tattooing a lot, and Tommy would be like, he always called me Matty, he'd be like, Matty's going to do a little bit here or a little bit there. So gradually over time, you're doing these little bits, and then it leads into you doing more, And I started, I don't know what I brought to the shop at all, but I definitely was doing some sort of, like, back in those days, kind of tribally looking stuff, kind of in line with that urban primitive stuff I was talking about, which I feel really good about, or just a little bit of my New Zealand culture, it definitely wasn't at all traditional or any sort of really educated tamoko or anything like that, but it definitely had that kind of New Zealand flair, lots of korus and stuff, and local people kind of went pretty nuts for it. But it worked out really well because Tommy would sort of say to a lot of these, kind of geezer types that we used to tattoo, and it was a pretty working class, pretty hardcore sort of clientele back in the day, lots of sort of pretty, I don't know, we used to tattoo a lot of football guys, a lot of firm guys, things like that. There was actually one guy, I'll just say his name was Dennis, like, who was like pretty high up in one of the firms, like. Tommy would always make me tattoo him, and I was always kind of pretty scared because of, like, Tommy's making me tattoo him, But, like, Dennis would come in and he'd get these, like, little flowers or a girl's name or whatever. And my theory on this is because this dude was so fucking hard, like, nobody was ever going to say, hey, pussy tattoo, right? Because they end up with their teeth down the back of their throat, Tommy had said to a lot of these guys, like, hey, this is Matty. He's with me. Take care of him if you see him out, And Tommy was kind of educating me too in his own way. Like, there's a lot of rules in Britain socially. I think if you grow up there, like, you're not really consciously aware of them. But, when you go out in the pub in Britain, it's a game of chess when you watch it, unless people are off their heads drunk. No one really bangs into each other. I became a British citizen, and, like, one of the questions on the citizenship test was, like, what should you do if you spill someone's pint? This is in the test to become a British citizen, right? The correct answer was option C. You should apologize and offer to buy them a replacement, But, like, Tommy was, like, cool. Like, he would take me out, this is when I'm first in England, and he'd be like, hey, when you stand at the bar, you stand with your fist like this so people can see that you're serious. And, I enjoyed every moment. It was really cool. But the point I was trying to illustrate was, like, I was pretty well taken care of in this town and pretty safe for the most part, so it was pretty neat. I also, like, I remember, like, it was really sad, but it worked out kind of, like, it worked out pretty interesting for me. Tommy had, many years ago, he'd been with some lady and had a kid, and he'd gone he was a carp fisherman, These guys, they, like, go and sit on a lake and they'll put tents around the lake, and they actually have, like, little radio controlled boats, and the boat takes out their bait on a line, and basically, you sit around a lake all weekend, and you probably have your boys there or whatever. Well, it's really popular in Holland, and he'd gone on this, as far as I remember this story, he'd gone on this trip to Holland, and when he came back, his missus had left him and taken the kid, and I think he had quite a lot of PTSD, obviously, about this, and he was going on a trip, like on the weekend, and I'd seen him during the week. He'd seen a bit off, and then the last conversation we had was just a little weird. Like, it was nothing. It wasn't nothing between us, but I was just like, man, it just didn't seem like Tommy. Tommy was a really confident guy, and went off on his trip as far as I knew. I got a call on, I want to say it was like Tuesday morning when I opened up the shop, and it was from his brother-in-law Ian around the corner, and he was like, hey, are you there? And I'm thinking, well, I answered the phone, so yeah, I'm guessing I'm here, right? And I was like, yeah, and he goes, all right, I'm coming around to see you, and I was like, oh shit, what's going on? And yeah, apparently Tommy had this nervous breakdown about going on this trip, and he was in a really, really bad way. And Ian sort of said to me, he's like, are you cool to run the shop? And I was like, I mean, I shouldn't have been running the shop because I'd only been tattooing a little while, but, I was able to do it. I said yes, and so I now for about, I can't remember exactly how long it was. I think it was close to 6 months, but I'm now like, I've now got the pressure too of making sure I bring enough money in to keep Tommy afloat because he wasn't able to earn. But it was also from an artist point of view, I suppose, like it was from my point of view, sorry, not an artist point of view, but it was like, it was good in that, I got to do a lot of stuff. But there was a lot of sort of like funny stuff that happened during that time period too. Like I remember one morning, I had this lady booked in early. Like I think in those days we opened it, it's early for me anyway. We opened at 10. Just saying too, in these days, whenever we opened, I was always 15 minutes late. So, but I remember we had I had like a barber's chair in those days, but it wasn't the cool barber's chair you think about with some like, Sailor Jerry everywhere tattoo studio. It was, it was this one from the 80s that had like this blue horrible kind of vinyl wrap on it. And I always I don't do this anymore. Every single one of my clients, no matter where they get tattooed now, I lay them down, It's almost impossible to have issues when somebody's laying down, in my opinion. But I'm tattooing this lady, and I forget what she's getting on her arm here, but her arm's like that, and I'm quite a bit lower than her. And again, we're tattooing, and she's talking a little bit, and then she said to me, she's like, I don't feel very well, and I was like, oh, okay, and I'm like, well, what do you mean? And she goes, well, I feel like I'm going to be sick. And I was like, throw up? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, let me get my trash can. And as I went to get my trash can, I grabbed it and I turned. And my memory of this, when this happened, is there's about a 2-second gap here that I can't quite remember. But when I came to, and I'm going like this, I'm pushing off this fucking deluge of vomit that's just hit me, yeah? And it totally hit me right in the face and like in the head. And as I'm doing this, I've got this very visceral sort of feeling and smell of like fish and chips, like just picture like fish, and I'm just like, holy shit, this lady's just throwing up all over me, right? And I'm all by myself at the shop, right? So there's no one there to sort of, I mean, had he been there, he would have been laughing, but like there's nobody there to like, and I just couldn't believe it. And I locked eyes with her. And I'll never forget, she looked at me as I'm dripping in her vomit, and she just said, I feel better now. And really condescendingly, I was like, good. But it was just, I don't know, like, I'm not entirely sure what lesson I learned from that. Maybe move quicker or something. But yeah, like one of the things I did learn during that period when Tommy was away, was like, just sort of understanding sometimes that, the clients are going through their own thing, even if you're having a bad day or something like that, and that you still have an effect on people. You have to act with intention, I've got a couple of stories to illustrate that. One is, and, I'm going to be a little condensed here because it was an emotional sort of story for me, but time for me sort of thing. But I had a lady one time ring up and book her friend in, which is really random. Like, it's weird when somebody rings up or calls to book somebody else in, there's already like, what's going on here? And she was just like a little weird on the phone. Something feels off. She needed it to be like a later appointment. I had this kind of pressure for needing to earn to help Tommy out. So I took the appointment, and these two ladies turn up. They seem a little bit out of place. They were definitely like, I'm not a class warrior, but they were definitely kind of middle class people, and we didn't get a lot of sort of, middle class people in the shop essentially, and they seemed a little bit out of water, The lady who was getting the tattoo, she had a postcard with a owl on it. It was sort of embossed in silver, But I remember looking at it and thinking, yeah, it's almost like a tattoo. It had all the little wing segments, like a traditional eagle, something like that, you know. Long story short, though, we moved the stents around a little bit. She's just, from my point of view, a little bit awkward. She's handling the pain when we start the tattoo, you know. But just, I'm not enjoying the experience. But then I discover listening to them that, you know, she's actually terminally ill and this is a bucket list thing, you know. Man, you know, I'm sitting there now thinking, God, I'm really glad I didn't sort of, you know, somehow sort of lash out at you verbally for just being a little bit difficult or something like that. And I feel like the world's biggest asshole at this point, you know. So at the end of the tattoo, you know, I said to her, I couldn't possibly charge you for this, hearing your story, you know. And so she gives me a big hug, bursts into tears, you know, they leave. And a few weeks later, maybe 3 weeks later, I get the postcard in the mail, and it's her friend who's written it. And, you know, it says, thank you so much. I want to say her name was something like Susan, you know. Susan really appreciated what you did for her, you know. And I'm really glad that that was her experience, you know, because had I acted differently, it could have been a different experience for her, you know. I could have maybe sort of been a bit shitty to someone who was already having a difficult time, you know. But the thing is, and I still think about this, is like I didn't give her a tattoo. Like I bought my soul back, you know, because I'd had these thoughts about how annoying this woman was being, but I hadn't considered, you know, what she was going through today, you know. And you learn as a tattooer sometimes to be intentional, you know. I remember it's a totally different story, nowhere near as sort of, you know, deep. But I remember in England, everybody, you know, they do their washing and then they hang it out to dry, you know. A lot of the time people's laundry setup is actually in their kitchen, so nobody has dryers or anything like that. And my wife had said to me, she was like, hey, I'm going to work at blah, blah, blah time. Before you leave, can you hang the washing out, right? No, sorry, my mistake. She'd hung the washing out. She said, can you bring it in? I think it's going to rain later, right? Which if you're trying to get your washing dry and then it rains, it's counterproductive, right? So I'm sitting behind this guy working on his back, and I look out the window, and all of a sudden, I'm like, oh no, it's raining, right? And I haven't brought the washing in, which means, you know, I'm going to be in the hot water when I get home. And out loud, I just went, fuck. And the guy jumps like, whoa, what? And he jumps up and he's like in front of the mirror and he's trying to grab the extra mirror we have. And he's like looking, he's like, what's wrong? And he wouldn't believe me, obviously, when I told him I was just thinking about the washing. You know what I mean? So, I don't know, you learn pretty quickly to sort of try and be just sort of intentional, you know, or at least seem kind of confident in your interactions, you know. This time, I had started going to just visit tattoo conventions. I wasn't working any tattoo conventions, you know. I definitely wasn't good enough yet to be even considering that. And this is when I think tattoo conventions were quite cool, you know. It was like you could learn a lot walking around, and it was interesting times though, like, you know, people would have their rheostats, like in the old days, you know, you could see the voltage control in that. And that people were so much more secretive about knowledge. Like some people would have like tape over their voltage, so you couldn't tell what voltage they were working at, you know what I mean? Like it was some big secret, you know. I went to a convention like somewhere around 2000 maybe, something like that. And saw this really cool artist I liked from Austria, and he was doing these amazing colors. Just his colors look so rich and vibrant. And I noticed that he had the labels covered up on his ink, but he had the same bottles that I had, and the only company that had ink like that at this time was like Mickey Sharp's, this traditional pigment, you know. And I'm looking at these colors, and it would fly in, and I'm just like, right, okay, it can be done, man. I want to go and learn how to make these really bright, you know, tattoos. And I've always been one of those tattooers, to be honest. My art has always been gradually getting better behind my tattoo skills, you know. I was always a bit better at tattooing than I was as an artist, you know. It's quite different, I think, to sort of how a lot of people get into it these days. A lot of people, you know, if they get into it, they're often like, hey, I'm good at art, I need to learn to tattoo. I was always all right, but I was always, and probably still am a little bit, better at tattooing than as an artist, And but anyway, so I came back to the shop, and every time I was doing a color tattoo, I was just intently focused on making it solid. And I really started after a little while being able to get it like looking sort of similar to what this guy was doing, And I caught up with this dude a year later, and I was talking to him, and I was like, man, thank you so much. Like, I watched you put those colors in, and I've been working really hard to get my color level, saturation up, and, it was really inspiring. And yeah, and I said to him, I'm like, I'd never seen anyone get that sort of color before with those inks. And he was laughing at me. He goes, oh, I don't use those inks. I just poured my colors into some of those bottles, And when I switched to the colors he was using, it was like way easier. But ever since, I was able to put in a fairly all right tattoo in terms of it being fairly solid, So it was, I don't know, it was another good lesson of it's, a lot of it is like belief in yourself, push yourself, and yeah, I don't know. It was pretty cool. I enjoyed that. Going to those conventions though, around this time, I met a lady called Shirley who ran a tattoo studio in Edinburgh called Urban BMS. It was Urban Body Modification Studio. She was a piercer, but I'd seen the studio recently in like a magazine interview. These were the days where you still got some good information from magazines, or if you had an interview or something, like, it probably made a difference in how busy you were, And we got talking, and I had a piece at the convention with me, and she liked it, and she invited me out for guest spots. And this sort of started the next part of my journey. I'd kind of realized for a little while that being in St. Neots, I was busy enough, but I was kind of king turd of Turd Island, and I don't mean to say that about that town, because I love that town, but competition is what makes you better, right? Historically, anybody that's had competition, they've usually got better. And I just kind of knew, I was at the end of the experience. Tommy had been back to work for a while, and it was just kind of the right time. So after doing a year of guest spots up to Edinburgh every, I guess, month or so, my wife and I relocated up there. Yeah. And it brings us into the next chapter. When I was going up to Edinburgh and working at Urban, I'd met an artist called Ian McAllister, and he'd been really welcoming. They had lost an artist just prior to me moving up there, and so Ian was really looking forward to having another artist on staff, essentially, so he wasn't the only guy, It was a fairly busy shop. And yeah, so I started hanging out with Ian. He lived in a little town called Inverkeithing, just outside of Edinburgh, and I'd had a lot of fun every time I'd gone up there, so we decided to move there, which was really random. Inverkeithing was a little town in Fife, which there was two types of people who lived in this town. There were the people that commuted to work, and then there were the people that had always been from there. To give you sort of a description of what Inverkeithing was like at night, before they got CCTV in, which happened about 6 months after I was there, when the bars kicked out, I would turn out the lights in my apartment, my flat, because we had a second-story apartment, just pull the curtains back, and there'd be a rolling brawl from one end of the street to the other at pub kicking out time, It was impressive. What's equally crazy about that is the day they actually got TV cameras in, that never happened again. It's like everybody knew, Yeah, but it was it was an amazing little town. I remember being in the store with Ian one night, and we went to buy some beers, and it's so random, but this local girl who definitely looked like she had some miles on her, she heard me speaking to Ian, and just clocked onto the accent, because obviously I'm not from Scotland, and I was about to put my beers on the counter, and the dude's about to check me out, and she literally just jumped up on the counter and went like this, right? And she said, I don't know, like I feel like she was hammered or something, and she felt like she was at some circus fair or something, but she just looked at me and went, put your finger in there, it'll tell you the truth. Which, later when we tell the story, we always refer to it as the whole of truth, you know what I mean? But yeah, I'm still bewildered by that a little bit. But yeah, Ian was this really great, I mean, he still is a really great guy, but he's somebody I'm still friends with today. Ian is one of those people that would save you from the fight he started, you know, and that's what I always appreciated about him. He's a really, really good dude. But so when I started working at Urban, I got a really fun story about Ian and Urban in general. Like, Edinburgh now is a really, really, really beautiful spot. It's always been beautiful. The city itself hasn't changed, right? It's made of stone, but it's socially, when I moved there, you know, and we're talking like the middle naught thousands, you know, like it had not, you know, like what Train Spotting came out in 96, you know, it had been a spot where like there had been quite a lot of junkie activity, and you know, they used to call HIV Edinburgh flu back in the day, you know, but it was like, it was really fun being there with a bunch of tattooers. And in Scotland at the time, they used to have these rules about the booths needed to be separated by a wall of certain, like it was really stupid. Like the wall didn't have to go to the ceiling, but it had to be like a certain height. It had to have sort of doors on it that closed. Well, anyway, these two junkie guys had walked in with like box knives to try and rob the place. God knows why they chose this tattoo studio. But like, they walked in, and they could just see the girl behind the counter. I think it was yeah. And, you know, the next thing that happened is all these doors opened, and like 3 burly tattooers came out, and like, yeah, the cops came, and they ended up having to leave, let them go, because we were told that we would probably get done for assault because they were all hog-tied and had a whole bunch of dusty footprints all over them. You know what I mean? So they ended up getting away with it. The other really cool story I remember about Ian, and I feel sorry for him on this one a little bit, is that these rooms that I was just telling you about with the doors, I remember Ian didn't make it in one day, or it was a day off and he was supposed to be in. And so for shits and giggles, everybody decided to like wrap his entire room in cling film. And then, you know, it just kind of, one thing led to another. Next thing, we're getting at helium balloons, and the room, like, we managed to get the door shut. Everything in there is cling filmed, and it's full of like helium balloons, ready for him to turn up next day. Next day, I think it was me, Maddie, one of the other guys there. We're all there waiting for Ian to turn up, right? He hasn't called in, but he's late. And we're like, oh shit, you know. He's about half hour late. All of a sudden he walks in, and he's like bleeding through his jeans, like he's slipped over. Like, I seem to remember, my memory is correct, we were talking a long time ago, but like he's kind of swollen up. And he walks in, and he's like, you wouldn't believe the morning I've had. I just fell over running for the train. And he walked over to the door and opened it, and all these balloons just came out and went around him. And he was just like, ah, and just left for the day, you know? Yeah. It was good fun in Scotland. Like, I really enjoyed, you know, Scottish people in general. They've got, some people would say it's bleak, but it's not. They've got a really good outlook on life, you know? I mean, when I was living there, when I moved to Scotland at that time, you know, they had, you know, Britain had military in Iraq, just like the States did. And in that year, the life expectancy for a male in Scotland was lower than the life expectancy of a male in Iraq, you know, due to diet. Like, they've got a high rate of like heart disease, you know. And yeah, they just had that great sort of sense of humor I really liked, you know. There's the old adage about the guy in a bar who says, oh, my brother just died, and someone else is like, oh, what size are his shoes? You know, like, yeah, I don't know, it was cool. It was a really interesting shop, Urban. It was all custom, you know. It was run by somebody who wasn't a tattooer, so it was all custom, but we also didn't have a photocopier or things like that, you know. And it was an interesting time for an all custom shop, because that sort of traditional sort of Sailor Jerry neo-traditional type movement that had been coming back to popularity in the States had kind of hit Britain, you know. So right as I was working at a shop where everything was all custom, like the kind of flash was really coming back to power as well. So it was a little bit of a mismatch. I was there for a year, and then the owner Shirley, just sort of fell behind, and the place ended up closing. I ended up then going to work briefly at a shop called Studio Gallery 13 with a guy called Jeff Cole. Jeff was from Philly, I believe. Well, he was originally from Nebraska, but he was a tattooer from Philly. It was a cool experience, It was cool to be in Edinburgh working for a loud American, but it was. I don't know, it really showed me the other side of tattooing too. I'd just come from a shop where everything was like, hey, we're going to work with your design. And Jeff was like, Jeff kind of showed me the ropes a little bit about, working as quick as you can without rushing, It was definitely, I don't mean this to sound offensive because he's a great tattooer, but it definitely had that kind of more used car type feeling to it, And he would tell me stories about like in Philly and stuff where like, back in the day, which was the opposite. What I'm about to say was the opposite of what I'd experienced, which is like, we wouldn't tattoo someone drunk back in the day, Whereas like Philly had this thing called the body chart or something, whereas like after a certain hour at night, and like every shop on the strip did this to make sure that it was kind of a monopoly, like they didn't outprice each other. But it was like, a tattoo here is this much, but after 9 it's this much, and it definitely brought the money element a little bit into tattooing that I hadn't experienced. And the other thing with it too was like, it was kind of cool for a little bit in between tattooing for the first time instead of drawing, we'd be playing Soul Calibur 2 on like Xbox or something. I think that's the skill set that I really took from working there was I got pretty good at Soul Calibur. Like, yeah. I don't play it anymore, but I still think about it. Yeah. Sadly though, like, I got on really, like, Jeff was another one of those, like, role models that I really looked up to at the time. And, the thing with tattooers sometimes, and then they have a home life as well. And I don't think his wife kind of enjoyed how much he enjoyed hanging out with the staff. And I ended up having a bit of a falling out with her. And for a few weeks I was without a job. But then I ended up over where Ian moved to, which was a shop called Red Hot and Blue Tattoo. And, another American guy, Paul Slifer, and Paul's probably, I would say, the artist that kind of almost gave me like a second apprenticeship. In tattooing, we always talk about who you apprentice under, but there's definitely people along the way, or if you do work at shops, the whole point of, I suppose, short of just earning a living, the whole point of like working with other artists is to continue sort of, increasing your skill set. And yeah, Paul was a fascinating guy to me. He was one of the first artists I ever worked with who had actually been to art school, and yeah, dude from like, I want to say like he was from Gloucester or something like that, Massachusetts. And yeah, just really good dude and just full of energy. You could tell he remembered what it was like to be a young tattooer. And yeah, I don't know, I felt like he put a lot of time into Ian and I, and I was at his shop for I think 2.5 years, something like that, but it definitely just one of the better experiences I had in tattooing. Yeah, like one of the things I learned during this period, was that sometimes you gotta agree with the client too, even if you don't really follow 100%. And other times it's like, it's important to have your voice just for your own integrity a little bit too. Like, I remember I've only ever kicked one guy out during a tattoo, like literally stopped and, just being like, dude, get the fuck out, But it was this guy and, I'm tattooing him and for some reason, I mean, sure, I'm making the tattoo for you and yeah, I'm enjoying engaging with you or whatever, but that doesn't mean that we share everything in our point of view. And he started talking to me and he was like, oh, have you ever been to Thailand? And I was like, yeah, I tattooed out there for a little bit at one point at a friend's shop, And he's like, oh yeah, And then he's like, yeah, Thailand's good. And I was like, I'm thinking, that's a strange lead-in, you know? And I'm like, yeah, Thailand's good, right? And he's like, yeah. And he goes, yeah, you know, it's good out there, you know, you can get at them young. And I'm like, what? You know? And he's like, yeah, you know, like when you're out there, you know, you can get at them young. And I went, what, you mean like people? And he's like, yeah, you know. And I'm like, what, you mean like sleeping with underage people? And he was like, yeah. And, you know, I don't need to tell you the rest of the story, but I kicked his ass out, you know. But the thing that got me with that later is like, okay, man, you're some depraved fucking pedo, but why did you think that I was going to be your buddy? That was the thing that really fucked with my head on that, you know. It's like, what am I giving off a strong vibe here or something? You know, like that's what really fucking did my head in on that, you know. I was short of also having to chuck somebody out. I mean, obviously chucking somebody out mid-tattoo, it's like, you know, I'm not getting paid for something that I've been working on, you know. Not that that's the point of that story. But, you know, other times too, there's funny things though with people, like, you know, I remember I'd tattooed, I was, you know, saying, I'd started to tattoo quite a few sort of military people around this time. You know, Britain had people in the war too, which was ongoing, and lots of contractors, things like that. And there was these Navy guys that started coming up to Edinburgh and getting tattooed regularly. And, you know, I get on really well with military people. And I'm tattooing this guy. I've tattooed him a bunch, and he's a sailor. And I remember like he's sitting, getting a tattoo here, you know, and it's a tribal tat. And I'm tattooing him, and he's like, oh, I was in Singapore the other day. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you know. He goes, yeah, I was hanging out with this really hot girl, you know. I'm like, oh, you know, cool, you know, sweet, cool story. And he's like, yeah, you know, I met her at this bar, and we're drinking, you know. Cool, you know, like, you know, you're a young dude. Got an imagination. I'm thinking, it must be cool to, you know. It's like, you know, oh, we're having a few drinks. And then he's like, and then I said to her, like, hey, do you want to come back to my place? It's like, cool, you know, you know, sweet. You know, and then this is where, like, again, my brain, you know, so in the end I agree with him, but he says to me, and again, I'm still tattooing him, you know, he goes, I got her back, you know, and like British expression, and he goes, got her back to my place, and he goes, I got her cacks off, which means her underpants, right? And I'm like, oh, you know, and you know, and then he goes, and she had a dick. Oh yeah. What did you do? I'll never forget this, right? He goes, well, obviously I fucked her in the ass. And I went, obviously. You know what I mean? Like, you know, now I agreed with him, but that story, like, I don't know, was that obvious? I'm not sure. Like, you know what I mean? It's just, you know, but again, it's just like, you know, like you're somebody's, you know, you're there taking them through an experience, you know, and you are their friend, you know, but like, you know, sometimes you don't have time to process things or ask for the finer points, or, you know, I don't know. I just thought that was hilarious. But
the stories that you take on and you get to hear,
yeah,
through tattooing,
yeah,
because you're sharing such a personal experience with these people.
Yeah, and they're on endorphins, right? You know, like they're endorphined up to the eyeballs a lot of the time, and yeah, like I say, I have no real opinion on that story. It was just, obviously, I was like,
it's something you wouldn't hear if you were tattooing them.
I mean, I wouldn't have thought so, right? I mean, I don't know, you know. I've only lived life as myself, and I don't have many stories like that. So. One of the other things that I sort of learned in this period, which really amuses me a little bit, the psychology of people, is that, you know, we would get a lot of people would come in to Red Hot Blue to get really, really cool tats, but then we would also get our mix of just like regular people from Scotland who wanted a tattoo, you know. So much so, like, you know, I had a guy come in one time and he said to me, he goes, I want the tattoo that goes here. I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what that could be, you know what I mean? But I guess in his circles, there's one that goes there, you know? Or like learning how to talk to people a little bit. Like I was doing a tattoo one time and it was a rose and it had some red and, you know, it needs a little bit of pink in my opinion. But I knew this type of guy that I'm tattooing, you know, I can't say to him like, do you want pink? Because he's just going to instantly be so secure in his own skin that he's going to be like, oh, I don't want any pink, right? So I said to him, I'm like, do you want some toned down red? You know? Or the other one we would say sometimes was like European red, you know, parentheses. I remember anyway, I can't remember which one I used, but like, the guy went out to the waiting room after, and Ian was tattooing one of his buddies. And, you know, oh, what'd you get? And he shows him. And the guy's like, oh, what's with that pink? And I'll never forget it, like verbatim, the guy goes, no, man, this is European red. You know, it just, yeah, I don't know. It was an interesting time, you know, and you learn little things like that, you know, that just smooth over interactions or like heading something off at the pass, you know. I feel like most guys like that, you know, they don't want pink, but if it's got another name, you know, like I said though, it's so weird to me to be so secure in yourself that your buddy could be like, hey, you've got pink, that means something, you know. It's like, you know, I'd be like, fuck off. So at this point, like, you know, I'm still in Scotland. I'm 28 years old and I didn't know it yet, but I'm going to be on the moving end soon, you know. When I do move, I will have been in Scotland, in Edinburgh, for 3 years. Probably 3 of the best years that I had, you know, before my time that I'm about to lead into. Around this time, I'd applied with my ex-wife for the green card lottery. I didn't really know about this back in the day, but the United States has a green card lottery, which freaks people out in the States when they hear this. They don't give away green cards. They give away the opportunity to be processed for a green card, and they don't give it to every country. You have to be select countries. So at this time, I'm a British citizen living in Scotland, but I had to apply using my New Zealand passport. They don't give this opportunity to British people. I have no idea why, but yeah. The thing with it, it's actually a really clever form of control because at the time when I was applying for this, I don't know any of the stats now. I only know what they did 20 years ago. But like, they would give away 50,000 opportunities to be processed. And they'd give you all the instructions. Like, if you haven't got this, you don't qualify, you haven't got that. Knowing that about 55% at the time of the people that would apply for this didn't qualify. So when it actually comes out later that you didn't qualify, they don't replace those visas, you know, so they only give away a small amount. The process though it took me about 2.5 years from the moment I got a letter to the moment I ended up with a green card was about 2.5 years. This was like a dream. I didn't even know this was a thing, and then the second year that my ex and I applied for it, like I won it, you know. She was able to go with me because we were married, but this is kind of, I haven't really talked about her in this, and there's really no need to, but it's kind of the beginning of the end for us a little bit. It had been my dream to go to the States. I didn't realize that she didn't really want to go. But at this point, we had already been planning to leave Scotland. We'd been away from New Zealand for about, I don't know, I suppose 10 years at this point. And we wanted to, before this visa thing came along, we wanted to go and spend a little bit of time in New Zealand. And I'd formed a friendship with an artist called Adam Kraft, who had an interview in a magazine in Britain that I'd seen, and he'd lived in Britain for quite a while, and he had a lot of, at this point, really, really good artists working for him, you know. And I sort of hit him up. I was like, hey, you know, I'm going to be coming back to New Zealand for a little bit, or that's my plan. And Adam was like, come and work. You know, I mean, that's literally what I said to him, and he was like, come and work. So about 6 months before we were moving back permanently, I went all the way over to New Zealand, did a guest spot, was super cool, enjoyed it. But I was going there knowing that our plan at this point was to go to the States. And I had just made friends with an artist called Fabian Nitz from Berlin in Germany. He'd invited us, Ian and I, to an art show in Berlin. We'd put some art in, we'd gone over there. And I had just kind of fallen in love with Berlin. I'd done a few guest spots over there. Just an incredible time and place at that point. Berlin, especially the east side, a lot of people were still leaving Berlin after the wall had come down. You know, it had been down for ages, but it was like people were still moving out of the city rather than moving in. So it was this incredible like capital city with these really great sort of like old east side apartments and that, and they were super cheap. The city was cheap. And I fell in love with the place. And I was kind of like, okay, well, if I'm going to move to the States, I want to go through here first. And I knew the process was going to take a bit of time. And, you know, euros spend a little bit better than New Zealand dollars. Like New Zealand dollars just don't go a long way. You know what I mean? We went to New Zealand and we were there for 6 months. I lived at Adam's house. It was awesome. Really great experience, you know. I probably gloss over this point in my career a little bit too much because Adam was a really good friend, and again, another one of those people that was another mentor, a few years older than me. But I'm now 30 years old, and we moved to Berlin, and we're there for a few years. My ex-wife and I, it was kind of the coup de grace really for our relationship. Like, you know, I'd been a young tattooer and just drew a lot, and you know, I just probably didn't realize in a way that I was killing the relationship. And then at the same time, when you grow apart from somebody, you know, you either make a conscious decision to try and grow back together or you don't, and that was where I was at. But I ended up, it was a really great time. You know, Fabian had taught me he was really into like traditional style tattoos, and Germany has actually a really rich history of it. But the time period that I was in Germany happened to coincide with people not really wanting that style. You know, they were very much into their black and grey. There was a lot of like sort of quite right-wing sort of like Viking sort of tattoos and stuff. Not that I don't think that anybody who was getting that sort of stuff was thinking in a right-wing mindset, but I'm just saying, you know, there was a lot of just really, it wasn't exactly what I was into. And in this time, I really quite enjoyed, you know, spending time with Fabian because he was one of a few artists that actually had built up quite a following in Berlin and, you know, with doing this style. So it was really cool. Yeah, good time period. But I worked in 2 shops. Fabian hooked me up with both of them. I worked at a shop called Straight Ink in Henningsdorf, and I worked at a shop called Königs Wusterhausen was the town, but I worked in a shop called Outback Tattoo. It's named because the guy who owned it had an affinity for like they did the Australian Outback, which was quite fun. But yeah, it was a cool time. My marriage disintegrated while I was over there, and I had been doing some guest spots. Again, Fabian hooked this up. Fabian hooked me up with, there was a place in Bavaria called Schweinfurt, which translates into pig fort. Not the most coolest name in the history of the world, but it was a US military town. You know, for the longest time after World War II, we had military bases in Germany. We still have a few, but there were a lot more of them, you know. And basically these US military bases kind of keep these towns afloat, or they did, because they brought in a huge amount of money, you know. And this was during the time period where, you know, we still were active in 2 wars, you know. Working in this shop, it was incredible. Like, I'm talking, you know, like I said, it's 17 years ago now, but I mean, I used to earn something like 750 roundabout euros a day back in those days, you know. Just huge amounts of money, because these guys would just come back after doing 18 months tours, and like they were just like, I just want to sleep, you know. It was funny because you'd see them get back, and the first week or 2 they will have ordered their, you know, their Dodge Challenger from the States, and 3 months later it's getting repossessed, you know. So you'd see it when it arrived and then when it left, you know. but it was a really cool time, you know, and it was definitely a period of time that sort of taught me to, like, you know, hate the game but not the players. We had a lot of guys that, you know, we tattooed that you would then hear they were leaving, and then one of their friends would be like, yeah, they got blown up and then, you know, they passed away. Or so we had a memorial wall in the studio, you know. It was interesting. Definitely a side of that war, I think, that a lot of people didn't see, you know. It was it was interesting in that a lot of the guys that I spoke to who were in the army, who were, you know, deploying from where we were, you know, there was always that attitude of a lot of people like, oh, they know what they sign up for. But, you know, I didn't see a lot of that. Like, I saw a lot of people who didn't have many other options, you know, that were in the army, you know. So it was interesting. Around this time, though, like I said, my marriage was breaking up, and I was really good friends with an American guy called Dan. He'd been a soldier in this area, but before that, he'd been a tattooer. 9/11 happened, and then he, you know, feeling patriotic, signed up, put his tattoo career on hold, and then, you know, I think he did several years, and then he was stationed in this place, met a girl, and he'd been doing a little bit of tattooing again, and he ended up being able to, while he was stationed there, work at the shop called Art and Style that I worked at with him. And yeah, I think, not entirely sure the exactly how it happened, but he ended up getting out of the army. Might not have been on the best terms, but he was still, now he was married to a local girl and he was tattooing in this town, you know. But anyway, I'd made good friends with Dan. Dan and I had been to a few conventions and stuff together in England. And, you know, I called him up. I was like, look, my marriage is done, you know, like, what am I going to do? I know if I stay in Berlin, at the moment, she's going to want to stay here. We'd just re-upped, you know, a lease. And, you know, Dan was like, dude, like, you already come down here, you already work here, you know, every 6 weeks for a couple of weeks, just come down here, you know. And he had owed me some money for a couple of conventions, and he was like, dude, I'll get a truck, I'll come pick you up. So he came up to Berlin and got me. And I'd met through him just one time this girl called Tara. And yeah, good story. But I'd met her, and you know, just somebody I'd met. It was one of his friends, and she was nice and everything. He'd said to me, he goes, I'm going to come pick you up. But I'm going on holiday with my family, you know, and Tara will be here to help you. Because, you know, I've just gone through a divorce, all my shit's at Dan's, moved to a different area. I got to find a place to live. You know, it's all been speculation up to this point. Now I'm here, you know. I've been with somebody for the previous 12 years, you know, we own properties together, all sorts of shit. And now I'm staying at Dan's house with all my stuff in boxes, you know. And, Tara, you know, I just thought of her as Dan's friend. I didn't know she had this crush on me, you know. And so Dan said to me, he goes, right, I'm going tomorrow. Tara's going to come grab you, so you got something to do. And so Tara picks me up, and I remember, like, thinking, you know, to tell the story truthfully, like, Tara was, you know, on paper, somebody that, if you were making a boy's list of what you were looking for in a person, a very shallow thing that you could do, which I wouldn't. But she wasn't really my list, you know. But anyway, so I met her through Dan. She's picked me up. I don't know it yet, but we're actually on a date. You know, I don't know this. So anyway, she takes me out to this festival. I remember eating ribs. You know, I've got this shit all over my face. We go out drinking later, you know. And, you know, I'm kicking a few drinks back. And she says to me, she's like, hey, you taking me home? And I'm like, you know, I just, you know, just left a marriage and that I can't really offer you anything. And she's like, oh, you know, whatever. We do a few more drinks. And she's like, hey, you taking me home? And I was like, just give me a minute. So, you know, I remember walking into the bathroom and having a conference, you know. I'm like, listen, man, theoretically we should have stopped drinking about 4 drinks ago, but I'm really going to need you to get on side with the team here, And then, you never want to give ultimatums, but I was very much like, you're getting a piercing if you don't work with me on this one. You know what I mean? But so I ended up falling in love with this girl, and I moved in with her and never left, Yeah, and we're still together today, So, yeah, that's a different story. But anyway, so
This is all in Berlin.
this is in Schweinfurt after my buddy Dan moved me to Schweinfurt, But anyway, so after this period of like really high stress and stuff, I'm now living in Bavaria. I didn't know this, but I'm living with Tara. I mean, I know where I'm staying tonight, sort of thing, right, at that time, but I didn't know, we've been living together ever since, And, it was pretty cool. Like, I'd just gone through a really high stress situation. Things obviously end because they're bad. That's why things end, profound. But like, yeah, but I'm having a good time, And just to give you an example, I mean, I've gone from high stress, got this huge amount of money coming in. I remember like one day, but I never cared about that. I always just wanted to make tats, and I'm just wanting to hang out with Tara now, have a good time. But I remember like my back's hurt me. I used to, had the wallet chain at this point in my life, back's hurting me. I remember one day like Tara like pulls out my wallet, and it's like I've just been stuffing all this money in it, I'm not really thinking about anything, I just go to work every day, make these tattoos, hanging out with her. It's the best time I've ever had, just a really rewarding situation to be in. And then my green card taps me on the shoulder, because I'd got my green card not long after I moved down there. And, the thing with the green card is when they issue it for you, you have 6 months to activate it. And I'm pretty sure they've done this or they used to be this way anyway. But like, they make it so you have 6 months to activate it. If you don't, you never get another one. It's meant to be a visa for people who've passed all the backgrounds. You're safe to come to America, and you clearly want to come. If you don't activate it, they're like, they just say to you, you will never get another one of these visas. You don't get it twice. So I'm now having a great time. I've got lots of money. I'm having a great time, and things are good. But I've got a tap on the shoulder, man. Like, hey, you've wanted this your whole life. So I said to Tara one day, I'm like, look, what are we doing? And she's loving living in Europe. She's over there. I didn't really go into too much detail. She's over there. She's a vet tech. She was over there. She'd gone over, in a civilian capacity, working with the military dogs and things like that. She'd been in a relationship that had ended. But she's loving living in Europe. She's lived in the States her entire life. But I just sort of said to her, and it was a difficult moment, because I was like, maybe I'm going, and this has been great. Right at the moment, it feels like the best thing I've ever been involved in. But I was like, I got to go, what do you want to do? And she was like, I'll come with you, And because of this previous relationship that she'd had, she had a house in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the military town, right? Like the last place on earth you want to live. But at this time, again, I'm kind of overwhelmed a little. Like, I've got to move to the States. I've got to open bank accounts. I've got to do all these things. And instead of doing what I would do today, which is I would decide where I want to go and then find a place to live and a job, we had a house to go to, so then I started searching for a job, and I had it all lined up before I went, There was 2 places that I wanted to talk to. I'd sent a bunch of like portfolios out, and I'd got a response from every single place that I hit up, which was cool. But yeah, so we ended up in Fayetteville, and in the meantime, I'd actually taken Tara out. We had about 2.5 months. I'd taken Tara out to New Zealand, and she met a bunch of my friends and family and stuff, and it was cool. They all loved her and that. But we get to the States and, you know, North Carolina's not my America, to be honest. And I don't mean to say it like that. I've got some really good friends from that part of the world, but it just wasn't my childhood dream, you know. And we went from being really, really busy in Germany to a military post that's got, I don't know, I can't even remember how many shops it had there now, but it was huge, you know. But I ended up working for...
What was your perception of America now that you just got here?
Like when I moved to North Carolina?
When you first moved to North Carolina and this is your dream?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I was looking for the Valley Girls and all the Ninja Turtles, bro. You know what I mean? Like, and, you know, I found North Kakalaki and we're armed up to the teeth, you know, and like, I mean, when we were, you know, growing up in New Zealand too, very open-minded, I think, or at least in my experience of the people I hung out with, very open-minded to different cultures. You know, anywhere you go in the world, if you listen hard enough, you're going to find somebody bitching about someone else, right? But I wasn't raised with racism in me, you know, and I remember being like in North Carolina at an intersection when we first got there. And I'm thinking, fucking hell, this is crazy. Like, there's like a Waffle House right here, and kitty corner, there's like a Waffle House, you know. And I said to Tara about it, I'm like, what the fuck's the story with that? And she was like, well, that's where the African Americans go to, and that's, you know. And it's like, man, what a culture shock, dude. I mean, I had more culture shock coming to the States than I had going to Germany, you know. I mean, even to this day, like, you know, I guess just growing up different, you know. Like, I remember this morning even, you know, just wildlife. Like, I got a text from Lance, and he said to me something like, he was like, the clean beaver gets the wood. You know what I mean? Now, I didn't grow up with any beavers, but I don't know. Like, I don't understand really what he's trying to say there, you know. I mean, you would think they would be clean, right? They live in water, right? I don't know. I'll lodge a complaint with them maybe. But, you know, like it was a lot of culture shock, you know. And the thing with that, though, a little bit is over time, you know, when you live there, you start taking it on board a little bit, you know. I don't mean the ideals or whatever, but just, you know, when people are sort of so separated, and it was kind of mind-blowing to me. I'd never really put any investigation into it, so I didn't really know to think about it, but, you know, it was a trip. But it was like, I couldn't get any, you know, this wasn't a very touristy town, you know, like there was a lot of people from around the US and military and stuff like that, but I couldn't get very far. Like, you know, I remember like trying to order gas in North Carolina, you know, and being like, hey, can I get $20 on pump 4? Oh my God, come over here. Like, hey, tell her what you told me. I'm like, 20 on pump 4, you know, like just, it was, I don't know, it was like a really strange experience.
Especially North Carolina.
Yeah, you know, and like I said, I feel I made some friends there though that I'm still friends with today, like really, really great friends, you know. But it was just it's like America on steroids. I mean, literally too. I mean, it's a military town, right? But, you know, I mean, with the tattoo shop that I ended up working in, and I love this tattoo shop. I love everything about it. But like, you know, I was telling you earlier about my friend Terry, you know, that I ended up working for, and he was a Green Beret guy. Probably, you know, I always swore I wouldn't work for anybody who wasn't a tattooer. But when I went into this town, I'd been used to getting really high percentage money, like in Germany. And, you know, that wasn't why I tattooed, but the percentages were much higher and things like that. And then so I'd come into this town, you know, and I had all this experience and a resume that, you know, I can pretty confidently say was better than most that were there, you know. Not that I think like that, but I was in line to get a job somewhere, you know. And, you know, people were like, yep, so we do a 50-50 split. And I'm thinking, I haven't worked for like a 50-50 split in like, I don't know how long, right? You know? But anyway, so when I was talking to Terry, you know, so he wasn't a tattooer, but he really wanted me to work at his shop. And he was a really, really nice guy, you know, again, you know, military guy. I'd just been around a bunch of them. And I said to him, you know, I gave him a number that I wanted. And he was like, oh, man, I couldn't do that. And I'm like, well, then I'm not coming to work for you. And, you know, there's definitely that element in life. Certain people respond well to the truth, and he was like, all right, like I think he actually kind of respected me for just kind of standing my ground, I mean, this would have been the only way I stood my ground against this guy. I mean, this guy could just pick me up and crush me into like a little ball of dust, really solid dude. But it was cool. But from like day one though, like it was just different. I mean, we had a Glock in the front counter. We had a shotgun in the sterilization room. Never needed it while I was there, but we had it. And it was.
What was the culture shock of that coming from New Zealand?
I mean, huge, man, huge. What's weird really is like when I was growing up. Farmers and that had access to guns, and we famously, this is all since I've been away. You've got to remember I've been away a long time. I still sort of, hail from there in my mind. But I mean, I get a lot of culture shock when I go home to New Zealand too, because I haven't lived there since I was in my teens, But yeah, there wasn't many guns there when I was growing up. We had a period while I was away where, there was a pretty big shooting in New Zealand a few years ago. But the culture, that makes New Zealand quite different is when that happened overnight, everything changed. A week later or, whatever it was, maybe a few months, those guns that were around to make a shooting like that, they were gone, yeah. I mean, I kind of, I don't know, I kind of enjoy, like I've gone through periods in my life, when I came to the States and then I'm hanging out with all these military guys and stuff, I embraced it. It was, like, I owned firearms. I used to go shooting on post. These guys are pretty cool, man. Like, I mean, I've shot every machine gun under the sun because I used to tattoo a lot of the, my buddy Norm. He was one of the instructors at the school there. It's like when Tara and I got married. We got married in Vegas about a year into being in North Carolina, and a whole bunch of us went out to Vegas. Because we're really smart people, we went for 10 days to Vegas, right? Fuck. Yeah. I think I got like 12 hours of sleep the whole time we were there, But I remember like, on the morning of my wedding, the boys went out into the desert and fired automatic weapons, And I remember a few years ago, do you remember there was that shooting in Vegas from out those windows, that horrible event with those people in that, I think it was like a country concert or something.
Yeah.
Somebody was passing a comment to me like when I was at home. They're like, "Man, can you imagine carrying a case of machine guns into a Vegas casino?" And I'm thinking, yeah, because I've done it. I mean, I carried them in legally, and locked up. But it's, it was just things like that. I mean, yeah, those things you just, as a young New Zealander growing up, that you just wouldn't ever.
You'd never expect it.
You wouldn't, yeah, and you wouldn't have gone out and fired automatic weapons on your wedding day, But I mean, I enjoyed every minute of that, It's not really who I am today. Like I've lived on the West Coast now since beginning of 2012, and yeah, I enjoyed the firearm stuff when I was in North Carolina. But I also had an event like before I left North Carolina. I used to go shooting every Sunday with my buddy Norm. Had a bunch of guns, out there, people in tattooing at different levels will often, depending on where you're at in life, there'll be different trades or things, And when I was in North Carolina, a lot of these military guys would be like, "Oh, you like guns? What would you give me for this?" I'm like, "Oh, I'll give you a sleeve for that," or something. So I had quite a gun collection, and we lived in the ghetto, I feel terrible saying that, but we did. We lived in a really rough area because T and I were doing all right, but we didn't make as much. We didn't make a lot of money there, And our upstairs neighbour used to watch us coming in and out. Thankfully, on this day that we left, he saw us leave. I had all my firearms in the car because I'd been shooting that morning. But we stayed at a friend's house and we came back the next day, and our place had been broken into, And I was pretty upset about it. But because we lived in the ghetto, a little backstory here, I used to sleep every night. This is a kid who grew up in a country where I'd never really been around guns. I mean, I'd seen them on farms and stuff before, maybe a rifle or something, but, I'd never really shot them or anything. I'm now sleeping with an AR-15, that's tooled up to the max, right? Like, I can drill a fly with this thing, right? And I'm sleeping with it next to my bed. This is the world I'm now living in. We've been broken into, and I'm a bit stressed out. I don't know, I'm saying stupid stuff. Like, I'm talking to the cop, there's two cops there, and I'm a bit stressed, and I say to him, just totally ill-advised, stupidest thing to say. But I said to the cop, I'm like, if this guy had broken in while I was here in bed, you'd be dealing with a homicide right now, right? And without skipping the beat, this cop said to me, he goes, Mr. Lloyd, as long as you shoot them on the way in, we don't care. He was telling me how to get away with it. Make sure you shoot them on the way in, right? I said to Matera, like, that night, I said to her, I'm like, I didn't grow up in New Zealand to now transitioned into this guy that's like thinking about how to kill someone. This isn't my America. And we planned to leave, and from there I'd already been kind of thinking, like the economic crash was slowly starting to catch up with the military a little bit, who had been my bloodline in tattooing. We're living in a military post. The wars are winding down. I said to T, I'm like, I think as much as I hadn't really ever wanted to go this route initially, I said, I think I'm going to reach out to some really big famous shops, And Tara was originally she's not from Seattle, but she was from the peninsula, Gig Harbor area. Her brother's in that route here, and we just I said to her, how do you feel about heading out that way? It was like kind of it was a toss up between here or Portland. And, she was like, yeah, I think initially she hadn't wanted, it's like she'd spent her whole life in this sort of area, but, it was just kind of coming to a fruition. We needed to be somewhere else. And I was starting to kind of lose faith with always having wanted to be in the States. Growing up, I would have liked to have been like San Fran or something like that. But when we first moved, at that time, it seemed expensive. we live here now. Like, it's pretty expensive, right? But, so it wasn't advertised or anything like that. But I hit up Aaron Bell at Slave to the Needle. I sent him a portfolio and just a letter and just said, hey, I always loved your work. I had read an article on him many years before that had really resonated with me when I was back in St. Neots. And I didn't hear anything back for a little while. I actually sent it to the shop though, that he, out of the two shops, him and Melissa, his wife, they run both of them, but Aaron doesn't usually spend quite as much time at Ballard. He's more over at Wallingford. And I'd sent this package to him by name to the other shop. But I got a message from him, and mad respect to Aaron. He's just super cool and old school, and he didn't ever say to me like, hey, you've got a job. He was like, why don't you come out and guest? So we were leaving North Carolina, and T and I were going to do a trip to New Zealand. So on the way out, we flew out via Seattle and saw him, worked there, and it was just kind of nondescript, but it was cool. And then I said to him, like, hey, I'm going to be back over this way in February. What do you think? And, I didn't really register this at the time because I didn't, I'd never really spoken to Aaron much, but he was kind of non-committal, whereas I'd got kind of a vibe early on that maybe it might be cool to work there. So it kind of I was like, oh shit, I would, obviously I was planning if I couldn't get a job there, I'd try and figure something else out. But it sort of became apparent to me, I think he could kind of tell that I was like, oh, and he said to me, he goes, nah, man, he goes, see that guy over there, he's been guesting here for 6 months, and, I think in those days, it's a little hazy now, but I think like, you guested, it was a guest artist situation so that, if it went south or you turned out to be an idiot or something, that you could be let go sort of thing, But yeah, so I guested with Aaron and Mel for like, I think it was a year, and then, we got taken on, and it was pretty cool, the one thing I really liked about working with Aaron is he's a guy that really values the truth, and yeah, it's just super fun. The other cool thing too, though, and this being over here was more the America that I'd always wanted. I think I left my metabolism a bit late for moving to the States. You know what I mean? Like, if I'd moved here when I was 18, I would have been just like sesame seed bun, like 24/7. It would have been awesome. But it's, I just really like the West Coast. I kind of like the attitude here. Seattle's really interesting to me, as a tattoo culture. Like, and when I moved here, I'd gone from dealing with military guys, where it was like, this isn't the sort of hard sell that I would ever give them. But, I went from dealing with guys where it's like, bro, get this tattoo, some chick will think you're awesome. That's basically the psychology of it, right? Something like that, to like Seattle where like, Yelp had just become a thing. And, people here, I'm not meaning it's not like this anywhere else, but people here, if they're successful in Seattle, there's a good chance that they've probably spent a life working hard. They went to school, they got good at something, they've now got a job. Their opinion really, really matters. And I don't mean it doesn't matter other places, but I had to kind of learn to sort of re-communicate with the clients a little bit. Like, to learn to sort of say to people like, I can see why you like this, but here's why something would be better. I hadn't really had to do that so much with the military clients, But once I got my head around it, it was awesome, And it's really important here because Seattle's one of those places where you don't just move to and get busy. One of the things I still like about it is, I have an Instagram or things like that, and it brings in a little bit of work. But I still get most of my work because somebody goes, oh, I saw one of your sleeves, That's pretty cool, But it's that it takes time. Like I've been tattooing now in Seattle for 13 and a bit years, and you don't just usually move here and end up busy, It's like it takes a while. And that was tough at first because, when you go to work somewhere like Aaron's shop, and rightfully so, Aaron's the sort of guy like, okay, you're not doing what you're doing, but a tattoo just walked in, so that you better take that. It's good. It was just what I needed at the right time. To go somewhere, be surrounded by a lot of talent, and then learn from that. And the thing that I enjoyed the most with working with Aaron was that it's sort of what they do in Japan. It's that osmosis learning. I got a lot of really great advice from him over the years and things like that. But the stuff that I really look back on and think I got the most value out of was, just learning like how much can you, so you always think maybe you're all right at something or maybe other people are quicker or something like that. But, how quick are they? Like Aaron was the sort of guy that, when I was working with him anyway, I could sort of see like, okay, you should be able to get, if you're good at what you do, you should be able to get this amount of stuff done in a day, And it was something that was measurable, something tangible to look at. Yeah, and that was the best experience that I got from my time at Slave. Got a lot of fond memories though, like for the... I do really like a good savage burn, like a good zinger. And even if I'm the one getting it. In 2015, Slave to the Needle had their 20-year anniversary party. And, usually when guest artists come, they would stay with Aaron and Mel. But, there were so many people coming to this that they were maxed out. They had an artist called Mel from Japan that is a good friend of Aaron and Mel's, and I'd met him before and stuff and got on with him pretty all right. We'd taken him to a baseball game on a previous guest spot and that he had, and Aaron and Mel said to me like, can you take care of Mel when he's here? And I was like, yeah, okay. It's a huge responsibility, right? Because it's like, when you take care of somebody from Japan, if the roles were reversed, you're going to be really well taken care of. So it's a responsibility. So it was super cool though. He came to stay with me, and he just wanted to do American stuff, like eat American food and like drink every night. I have no idea how he was able to function as a tattooer every day and drink like this, you know. But I remember one night I had like an apartment down on 34th overlooking Lake Union, you know, and we came home pretty buzzed. And we went out onto the balcony there. And I don't know what it was, you know, like when you're talking to somebody sometimes who's like, you know, his English is a million times better than my Japanese, which is non-existent. But I don't know, I just got into this very sort of sweeping thought process, and we walked out onto the balcony and I said to him, I'm like, yeah, you know, sometimes I'll come home and just come stand out here and look at the view. And without skipping a beat, he goes, put on Kenny G, think about ex-girlfriend. I was like, you dick. But it stuck with me to this day because it was such a savage burn, you know. Yeah. But, you know, the other thing that I really enjoyed about, again, you learn from people and how to carry yourself, like, you know, I found in Britain more, people would talk a lot about being tattooers, you know. And one of the things I really enjoy, you know, with hanging out with all sorts of artists, but like specifically Aaron, is like a lot of, we'll always get to a conversation about tattooing at some point, you know, but, you know, for the most part, you know, that's what he does for a job. He enjoys talking about life and things like that. And so, you know, so do I. And we were in Norway together. It was actually after when I say together, we were there at the same time. Aaron was there with his family and that, and hanging out, you know, on a road trip. And I happened to be over at Lucky 7 doing a guest spot with some of Aaron and Melissa's friends. And we ended up catching up one night, you know. And like, I don't know if you've ever been to Norway, but like Norway is, and this is 10 years ago, just ridiculously expensive, you know. Tara had been with me a few days before and we'd wanted to get some drinks, and we're just walking down, it's a beautiful day. We're walking down and there's like, the footpath, there was something just like a TGI Fridays or something. And then on the other side of the footpath where cars would normally park, they'd built a little sit-in bar area. You know, there's no bar there, but you could sit. And, you know, I'd heard that Norway, Oslo was expensive, but we went and sat down and we ordered a round of cocktails. Now, like when I was in Norway, people usually are just drinking beers and stuff, and they're like pre-game quite a lot, right? So we've got all these like Norwegian people around us who all speak perfect English, you know, and I order a round of drinks. And I remember like, looking over and a few people are making eye contact, you know, like, oh, you know, had the drinks or another round. I look over, this guy looks at me and he like winks at me, you know, it's like, hey, you know, good for you, you know, sort of thing. And so like, you know, Tara and I drink that round of drinks. We order another round of drinks. Virtually the whole seating area is looking at us now, and it's sort of like, you know, hey, you only live once sort of thing, good for you, you know. We get the fourth round, like my memory here like is that like, I almost want to say someone clapped, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, we get our bill, it was like close to $400, you know. And so where I'm going with this story is, Aaron ends up coming out to dinner with these tattooers that I'm hanging out with. I'm there, and they're all tripping, you know, because they're like, oh, they want to talk to Aaron and stuff. And Aaron just being pretty clever about you know, this isn't his first rodeo going out to dinner and hanging out with a bunch of tattooers, right? And real early on, he's like, okay, first one to mention tattooing gets the bill, right? About 2.5 hours, nobody says anything, right? But everybody's hardcore drinking. And then I can't even remember like which one of the guys it was, but like about the 2.5 hour mark, somebody leans over to Aaron and they're like, so what black are you? You know, and the word hadn't even fully come out of the guy's mouth. Aaron's just like, you're getting the bill. You know, but it was, I don't know, that's what I was saying. Like coming from Britain and that, like I really kind of enjoyed more that side of people and getting to know people in tattooing, you know, as having a bigger identity than just being a tattooer, you know. Because I don't, when tattooers are all together, it's like, it does tend to be that way a lot of the time, you know. Yeah. It was, and still is, like one of the best decisions I ever made going to work there. And, you know, I'm still grateful to this day to be friends with everybody from the shop, you know. There'd be too many stories there really to just encapsulate like this, but just want to tell a story about my buddy Lance, who you've done an interview with. Lance and I just like gelled really well from the moment he started there, and we lived together during COVID. But yeah, the first time that Lance and I ever met was at a party up on Capitol Hill at Damon Conklin's shop. And I met him at about 3 a.m. outside a bathroom. And I was pretty inebriated, but I remember saying something like, "Do you like to party?" And he said, "Yeah, I like to party." And that was it. We actually just went different directions. But when Lance started working at the shop, we didn't really hang out right away, but about 2 weeks in, he came around because I lived just opposite the shop, came around and we hung out. And we were hanging out until 45 minutes before we started work the next morning at 10:15. And we then had to go into work, with our uniform smile. And I remember saying something to him like, "Oh, what did you do last night?" You know what I mean? But we'd just parted company at like 45 minutes earlier. But those are the days too you're a tattooer, That never used to happen that much. But, I always had that ability to like only blame myself and dig deep, You're not a tattooer until something goes wrong, when people talk about like what it means to them, if you get a call saying, "I've had this happen, your wife has had a seizure and she's on her way to the hospital," that's when you're a tattooer. It's like when you got to finish that tattoo, And but also sometimes when you've got a raging hangover, that's when you're a tattooer as well, But I just wanted to finish. I just thought of like 3 stories that I didn't include in the timeline, but that they make me laugh a little bit. They definitely, I think, they definitely encapsulate what I love in tattooing. The first 2 are about a friend of mine called Wok. Wok, when I first met him personally, used to have a tattoo shop in Nelson with another guy called Gene. Gene's a great guy too. I just don't have as many Gene stories. But Wok was one of the first people that I really looked up to in tattooing that had a really similar personality to mine. I remember being at his shop one day and he's tattooing this lady and just started, Again, I think she was maybe sort of biker chick, but I can't really remember. But they start the tattoo, it's some sort of tribal pattern, something like that. And she just says to him, "How much is this tattoo?" They obviously hadn't discussed it. Money wasn't maybe the issue, And Wok said, "Oh, it'll be about 200, I think." And she said, "What about if I suck your dick?" And without skipping a beat, and this is what just blew my mind, just instantaneously, he went, "Oh, I think I'd have to charge you extra for that." It's just amazing, I also remember, one time there was a kid waiting to get tattooed, and I think he'd been a little difficult, because I can't imagine otherwise why Wok would have sort of fucked with him a little bit. But, the kid had been a bit difficult, but now he's kind of sitting there a little nervous. And Wok went up to him with 2 tattoo machines, and he said to the kid, "This one's Gentle Dove, this one's Satan. Which one do you want me to use?" And the kid went, I think Gentle Dove." And Wok just said to him, "Just kidding, they're both Satan." But again, I just thought that was incredible, The last story that I was going to tell to you is the end of my urban primitive look, It happened in 2 phases. One was I used to work with Shirley, who was a piercer, who had her ears stretched up really big. I only had mine to about 10 mil. And on a winter's day, she walked in, and it was so cold, she walked in, she had big hoops. And as she was right by the counter I was leaning against, her ear split open, and the hoop just went, whoosh. And I instantly just went into my room, stood in front of the mirror, and took my hoops out. But when I used to have white boy dreads. This is when I was in Edinburgh. And when they went, I didn't have a key to the shop, and I was sitting, leaning against the door one morning, waiting for whoever was coming to let me in. And this homeless guy is walking down the street, you know, and he's got quite a swagger on. He's holding a 6-pack of Special Brew by Carlsberg. I don't even know if we have it over here. I'm assuming probably not, but it's kind of the official Jakey beer. Like, it's, you know, the most bang for your buck. And he walks past me, and I'm sitting looking at him, you know, just leaning against the wall, legs out. He walks past me and stops, turns around, smiles at me, puts his hand in his pocket, pulls out 3-pound coins, sort of half chucks them at me so they land at my feet, and he goes, "There you go, son, I already got mine." That's when the dreadlocks went. When I started getting money from the homeless. Yeah. I left Slade briefly. I worked at another shop. That was cool, but neither here nor there. Made some great friends there. I worked with Dustin Adams, Caesar, you know, 2 guys who are known locally, Tim Kelly. It was a good experience in that sense. But the goal was always to kind of maybe just get back to my roots a little bit, like a smaller setting. So I opened Ronin Tattoo. It was interesting because at the time, I don't know that it still isn't, but it was the only legal sort of studio that was done like this, private studio at the time. I know there's a lot of other private studios now. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of setting too, I don't want to go too much into it, but yeah, and it was based on sort of my own experiences, you know, just after working in shops for a long time, there's always arguments about music, things like that. I'd got tattooed many years ago by Fabian Nitz at his like private studio, and the experience was awesome. Like, Fabian would just put on movies that he liked, and before you knew it, you know, like, oh shit, 3-hour tattoo, it's done, you know. And that was just sort of the environment that I wanted to create for my clients, and a little bit for myself. You know, I'm a like real movie buff. I'm not watching movies when I'm tattooing, but you know, I am one of those people, like, I enjoy watching movies multiple times, so I'll just be sitting there listening or laughing at the jokes. And it's kind of cool too, because you get like you know, I can kind of time my sessions through movies. It's like, okay, you know, I should be here by the time this movie finishes, and you know, we can probably do 3 movies in this session, and you know, I don't know, it's just stuff that's quirky like that, but I enjoy it, you know. It's the weird thing about tattooing sometimes is how quickly time moves. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's quick, and you know, I've been here now in 6 years, you know. It's like, I'm like, where did that go? You know, I opened this place, so the only sort of, you know, I know everybody had their own experience during COVID. I was like really, really bummed out when it happened, because this place was just rolling for me, you know, like I was just really enjoying tattooing, and then COVID happened, you know. And it's, you know, I suppose in terms of a business, my setup is probably pretty low overhead compared to a lot, but it was still my setup, and it was on hold, you know. So yeah, just really grateful to like the clients that I have. You know, I have some really good long-term clients. I get pretty lucky. I get to do, you know, a lot of large-scale stuff and in a Japanese style. So yeah.
What was the influence moving into Japanese?
Well, you know, it's interesting really, because I probably didn't go into it much in the stories, but like, I really enjoyed when I was sort of exposed to, you know, the American folk art style coming to power when I was in Scotland. You know, I'd met people like Steve Byrne, and you know, they were just really inspirational, what they were doing at the time in Britain and things like that. And where I'm going with that is, I feel like those styles have some similarities in that, you know, it's like strong black lines, you know, smooth, solid colors, or, you know, use of black and gray. And it just kind of seemed really, in terms of interest factor, to be a natural progression. You know, like when you're younger, when you get into, when you're picking your first tattoo, the tendency is to, you know, and rightfully so, right? You're deciding to do something as an individual, you know, so you pick something that's maybe different to what you've seen. Whereas I feel like the longer you're in tattooing, you start to pull more from tried and tested. You know, it becomes more, instead of being sort of, I want to reinvent the wheel, it becomes more of a like, I want a part of something. I want something that looks like this, you know. And I don't know, it just kind of came that way to me. I'd already sort of branched into doing a little bit of it in North Carolina when I was there. And I'd had some good results, but those results were more often than not based on the fact that I was looking at something somebody else had done, and then, you know, it worked for them, so just taking that formula, you know. When I went to work with Aaron, you know, it really solidified to me that, like, I wanted to do more of that style, you know. Not to take anything, I don't mean to try and take something away from him. I just mean, like, it was so inspiring seeing what he was doing, you know. And whenever you see something done well, you know, that's when you really, like, you're like, you know, yeah. But so I think that's where it came from, really. It just sort of seemed to be a progression, you know. I'm not saying that everybody that does American traditional or something like that is going to just gravitate towards Japanese-looking tattoos, you know. But that, for me, it just kind of made sense.
How long have you been tattooing at this point?
About 27 years.
27 years?
Yeah.
Over 27 years, there's got to be a few significant life lessons or things you've pulled from.
Yeah.
The people you've met, the experiences. Is there anything that stands out to you that tattooing has really made you learn or represent?
I think, you know, definitely a little bit of ego death, you know, like realizing that you don't really compete with everybody else. You compete with yourself, you know, and that, you know, there's definitely been periods of my career where I've put more effort in and others where I haven't, you know, and then realizing, looking back, that always it was better to put in the effort, you know. We all go through sort of cyclical things, right? But it's, you know, just kind of realizing that you get back what you put in, you know. And there's that old adage, really, that, you know, like, you shoot for the stars and hopefully hit the moon, you know. I don't think, you know, I've anywhere near achieved that at all, you know. One of the things I'm kind of personally enjoying in tattooing is that I always kind of went up in steps, you know. I didn't ever start somewhere with a huge bang or something like that, but I feel like I'm still progressing, and lately more than ever I'm feeling more motivated and just more inspired, you know. I've been like visiting Japan and that. That obviously got put on hold a little bit with COVID, but I've started going back again now, and, you know, it's just cool to have it again sort of inspire like it did when I was younger, you know, where you're just excited to be around it, you know. Yeah, I miss a little bit sometimes, like, engaging with other people. I don't miss the kind of internal politics sometimes of working in big groups, but I do, you know, I do miss a little bit sometimes interacting with somebody who was maybe in a similar mindset or something like that, you know. But I'm really happy, you know, like, if this is what I do for the rest of my tattoo career, I'm happy doing it, you know. And I feel like, you know, as I was saying to you before, like, you know, I don't have a shop front. I don't make it so it's easy to find me. You know, people have to send an email, and then you're probably going to have a follow-up Q&A with me, you know, or something like that. That's not to be annoying to people. It's just, I find that it weeds out the people that really are just, you know, maybe having a drink on a Friday night. They're like, ooh, I want, you know. But it's, yeah, I'm really happy the way I'm able to operate. And, yeah, I think I've finally sort of found my enough in tattooing, you know. Like, I'm really happy doing what I'm doing.
Obviously, tattooing's been your whole career, but could you imagine what would have happened if you hadn't found tattooing?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm one of those people that I was fortunate to find it, you know, like...
was there ever another option, though?
Not really. I don't think for my mental health there was. I really struggled growing up, you know, like, I kind of knew I was dicking around at school, you know, like, I knew I wasn't putting in the effort. But I also, you know, I grew up in a world where sometimes, you know, the people that I was around, like, were short on dreams, you know. Like, it was definitely, whenever I would talk about, I want to do something like this, you know, it was always told to me by the adults around me, that kind of angle of, you know, like, well, you know, you kind of got to expect that life isn't going to be how you want it, you know. And I don't know, a bit of a dreamer, I suppose, you know. But at the same time, you know, I guess I could say like I'm lucky to have found it, but it wasn't a lot of luck either. You know, I moved countries. I wanted to do it. You know, I chased people down when they said no. You know, yeah. I mean, when I was younger, getting tattoos, the kind of rule was like you could ask anybody anything, really, the unwritten rule, provided you went and got a tattoo from them. You know, you were kind of paying for the information, you know, and people didn't tell you all their best moves or whatever, but, you know, I don't see a lot of that anymore. Not that I really care what other people are doing, but, you know, people will randomly hit you up with a question, you know, hey, how do you do this? It's like, who are you? You know.
You work for it.
Yeah, you work for it. But you know what? If somebody takes that approach with me, I acknowledge it, you know, because you also got to remember what it's like to be in that position, you know, and yeah. But no, I'm really grateful for 27 years. I have no idea where that went.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, dude.